But my name is Dan Weiser, and I myself formerly was in law school. I spent a year at Harvard Law School. I was actually the class behind Obama. But I did not like it very much, and I knew I had gone to Columbia Undergraduate University, and I had wanted to be a history professor, and I should have gone that route, but I ended up taking a course with Jack Greenberg, who was one of the lawyers for Brown versus Board of Education in my senior year, called Law and Social Justice, and I was a very idealistic guy, and even though Greenberg said I would probably hate law school, I went to Harvard. After about 3 weeks, I thought I had a brain tumor, and so then I knew I had to sort of come up with something else, and that's when I formed a piano trio with a clarinetist and a cellist who were also not happy. I don't know what happened to them, but we were known as the Disgruntled Law School Trio, and I managed to stay through a whole year and did very well, got on the honors list, but I did a final concert at the end, and Martha Minow, who was my civil procedure teacher, who was a musician herself, said I could have been a fine lawyer, but that I chose the right path to go into music. But now I get a chance to sort of go back and talk about some other composers who actually had either gone to law school or in a couple cases had actually been lawyers for a while and then gave it up to do music. And there's more than you think. I'm going to do 9 tonight, but I'm leaving off people like Stravinsky and Hammerstein and a few others. But I'm just going to try to give an overview of some of these musicians and composers, starting in the Baroque period and all the way up into Cole Porter, where I'm going to sing you out at the end. All right, so I'm calling this little lecture Leaving the Law. Hopefully I can do it in an hour. I'm going to try to keep it close. These are composers who gave up the law. Here's a couple quotes. I always like to collect some quotes. The great Plato, the philosopher, said, "Music is a moral law. It gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, a charm to sadness, gaiety and life to everything. It is the essence of order and leads to all that is good and just and beautiful." My next quote is by Robert Schumann, who I will talk about in the middle. He was sort of my guide. I knew that Schumann had gone to law school and had not liked it and left it for music. And so we played a lot of Schumann when I was in that trio. But he once wrote a letter, which I'll read more of, and he said, "My whole life has been a 20-year struggle between poetry and prose, or if you like, music and the law." And my favorite movie quote comes from the great movie Adam's Rib, with the 2 lawyers, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, and they have a musician friend, Kip, who plays piano, and he tells them, "Lawyers should never marry other lawyers. This is called inbreeding. From this comes idiot children and other lawyers. Lawyers should always marry musicians." I'm sure that's not true, but I was married to a lawyer briefly. That didn't go well when she tried to steal my piano. I'm now married to a doctor, which is a much better thing to be married to. So here is George Frederick Handel, who was one of the great Baroque composers, along with Johann Sebastian Bach. In fact, they both had the same birth and death years. Handel's father was a prominent and successful barber surgeon for the local duke in Halle in Germany. He determined early on that young George should study civil law, so he forbade him from partaking in what he called musical nonsense. But supposedly Handel smuggled a little clavichord, a tiny piano, into his room so he could practice when he was a young boy, and he gets good enough that he's able to then begin organ lessons and start composing at the age of 9. The father dies when he's about 12. Handel goes to the University of Halle, and though he is not officially enrolled in the Faculty of Law, we do know that he attended several lectures by the noted and controversial jurist Christian Thomasius, who had been expelled from Leipzig University for his very liberal views at the time. He was one of the first to lecture in German instead of Latin, and he talked about the freedom of mankind, kind of Enlightenment thoughts about reason and justice and the majesty of the law at a time when that was still very early on in its thought. But Handel would spend most of his life in London, writing 42 operas, 25 oratorios, including his most famous work, The Messiah, and over 600 vocal and instrumental works. So what I'm going to play is a piece he wrote probably in around 1720. This is a Passacaglia from the 7th suite for harpsichord. Passacaglia simply means a repeated bass line. You'll hear the same thorough bass, as we call it, the bass line over and over. The most famous example of this is Pachelbel's Canon in D, which really should be called Pachelbel's Passacaglia in D. It's the same notes over and over which he does these sort of variations. So here's a little Handel Passacaglia to start us off. that's a little George Frederick Handel to get us started on the composers who left the law. Our next composer, if I can get back to it, is Carl Philipp Emmanuel Bach, born in 1714. This was one of the 20 sons of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, and not all with the same wife, fortunately. One of the wives died, but 20 children, many of whom became musicians, several or at least 5 different boy composers, but many of them also studied the law. Carl Philipp Emmanuel studied jurisprudence at the University of Leipzig and actually got his legal degree in 1738, but never ended up practicing the law. He did write a very influential treatise about playing this new keyboard. The new piano was being developed during the 18th century out of the harpsichord into what we now know as the modern piano, and he called it the Essay on the True Art of Playing Keyboard Instruments. This was a very influential book studied by Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. In fact, Mozart was talking about C.P.E. Bach. We sometimes confuse it thinking he's talking about the great Johann Sebastian Bach, but Mozart was not a huge fan of the Papa Bach. He loved C.P.E. He said, C.P.E. Bach is the father, we are his children. C.P.E. became the court composer and musician for Frederick the Great, one of the enlightened rulers of the 18th century there in Berlin at Sanssouci Palace. He wrote with a very wide expressive range, rather unpredictable shifts in harmonies, sometimes moves from minor to major, what he called a more true and more natural feeling. He called it the empfindsamer Stil, the more expressive style. And he once said, "A musician cannot move others unless he too is moved. He must of necessity feel all of the affects that he hopes to arouse in his audience, for the revealing of his own humor will stimulate a like humor in the listener." And I'm going to play a piece that some of you might recognize if you yourself have played piano, or if you have any children who play piano. This is a very a common piece, more intermediate piece that young kids play called solfeggio, or sometimes it's known as solfeggetto, written in 1766. And you'll hear this sort of one continuous outpouring of line mixing between the right and the left hand for a very dramatic finish. So here is the solfeggetto by C.P.E. Bach. That's it, a big quick flourish to the end. That was Carl Philipp Emmanuel Bach. I'm going to switch over now to England. I'll make a brief stop there and talk about the music of Thomas Arne, who is probably the most famous English composer of the 18th century. Here he is, born in 1710, lives till 1778. He came from a family of upholsterers, actually. And his parents also did not want him getting involved in music. He apparently smuggled a little spinet piano into his room to secretly practice, and ultimately attends Eton College, where he is apprenticed to a solicitor for 3 years, but apparently spends most of those years attending the Italian opera and other musical gatherings and doing very little law during that period. He writes music for over 90 stage works, although sadly most of the scores were actually lost in a very big fire at Covent Garden in 1808, where his scores were being held. He was a Catholic and a Freemason, much like Mozart and many of our founding constitutional fathers here in America. And his most famous piece, which I'll play in a second, is the song Rule Britannia, which came from a show he wrote called The Mask of Alfred, Alfred the Great, in 1740. Interestingly, Arne actually was one of the first composers to appeal to the law over copyright issues. There was not really much copyright law at this time, but he did try to sue, claiming that some of his songs had been illegally printed and sold by London publishers. Like many things, it was settled out of court. I don't know how it actually ended up working out, but fascinating that he sort of goes to the law to try to help with his music. So here's a very famous tune that you will recognize, was used by the Royal Navy, of course. Handel, this was so popular in the 18th century in England that Handel actually quotes the tune in one of his oratorios from 1746, and it's always performed at the last night at the proms, the BBC proms. So let me go back and let you watch me. Here's Rule Britannia. Feel free to sing along if you want. Lawyer, or at least a law school person who writes one of the great English tunes, Rule Britannia. All right, we're going to make our way now into the classical period, and the name that we most associate with this classical period in the late 18th century is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But before there was Wolfgang, there was actually his father, Leopold, who was a composer, born in 1719, dies in 1787. His parents actually wanted him to be a Catholic priest, but he withdrew from the St. Salvator Lyceum and enrolls instead at the University of Salzburg in 1737 to study philosophy and jurisprudence. Although you got to put study in quotes, because apparently he was expelled a couple of years later for poor attendance, having, quote, hardly attended the legal lectures more than once or twice. I know exactly what he went through. And in 1740, he begins his career as a professional violinist and rises to be deputy Kapellmeister for the Archbishop of Salzburg by 1763. Right around this time, he also writes a great treatise on violin playing and violin pedagogy that was used all the way into the 20th century, a really comprehensive treatise about violin playing. But Leopold is most famous for his son, Wolfgang, born in 1756. Leopold described him as the miracle which God let be born in Salzburg. And Wolfgang had an older sister, Nannerl, who was also a great genius, and they toured around for several years, sitting on the laps of Maria Theresa and other royalty, getting kisses. There's a great quote by Wendy Wasserstein talking about the prodigy, what a wonderful prodigy Mozart was. She said, it's because of Mozart that it's all over by the age of 7. And then my other favorite quote about Mozart, he also dies very young at the age of 35. Tom Lear, the wonderful satirist, said once, it's a sobering thought to think that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 5 years. So I'm going to play a piece. This is by Leopold Mozart. He was not a fantastic composer by any means, but this is a little light work that he wrote to probably around 1762, would likely have been written for harpsichord, but I'm going to play it on piano. This is his Sonata in B-flat major, the first movement.
Jaunty little sonata by Leopold Mozart. All right, we're now going to get really into the meat of the matter, and I'm going to get to the wonderful Robert Schumann, who again was sort of my guide in leaving law school, knowing what I did about Schumann. He was born in 1810, dies in 1856, and he really is the quintessential romantic composer. That's of course, the 19th century. So many wonderful poets, Byron and Keats and artists and composers. I always say that there's three things that you could do to be a great romantic. One, you could die young. Two, you could have syphilis. And three, you could go insane. And actually, Schumann did all of those. So he gets the triple crown and really is that true romantic composer. His father was a poet and a writer who owned a bookstore in Zwickau, Germany, and actually launched a series of successful pocket editions of the classics of all the nations, and translated himself several English novels, especially by Sir Walter Scott, who he loved. Robert took early music lessons and showed some talent, but his mother was a very stern sort of woman, and she believed the arts offered little prospect of either security or success, which is still true today. He attends the University of Leipzig and writes to his mother while he's there, trying to figure out what to do. He said, "I am perplexed beyond measure by what to study next. Chilly jurisprudence, with its ice-cold definitions, would crush the life out of me from the outset. Medicine I will not, theology I cannot study. So I struggle endlessly with myself, and I look in vain for someone to tell me what to do. But there is nothing to be done. I must choose law." I certainly felt a little bit that way myself, sort of confused and thinking, well, there's a stability in here. It was not for me. While he's in Leipzig at school, he meets Frederick Wieck, a piano teacher, who was, his claim to fame was he had a young daughter named Clara Wieck, who at that time was about 9 years old in 1828. And she was already on her way to becoming a superstar pianist, had played in the Leipzig Gewandhaus, showed just amazing ability, not only technically, but to move people in a way that people were not used to hearing. Goethe, the great poet, said that Clara had the strength of 6 men in her playing. He formed a piano trio as well while he was in school and begins to compose music around this time. He actually switches to the University of Heidelberg in 1829, supposedly under the pretext of taking classes with Justus Thibaut, famous professor of law, who was also a well-known scholar about musical aesthetics and had organized an amateur choir there in Heidelberg. Schumann got to be rather close with him for the musical side, but Thibaut once said that Schumann had neither the taste nor the aptitude for the law. So it's a good thing he decides to get out. In 1830, he hears the demonic violin virtuoso Paganini play. Paganini, supposedly very gaunt-looking man, but some people thought he had made a pact with the devil to play the way he did, and he really amazed many people like Liszt and Chopin and Schumann who heard him, and that's when he decides to become a musician. So he writes this long letter, which I'll read some more of because it's just a wonderful letter, from July 30th, 1830, as he's trying to figure out what to do. He writes, "Dear Mother,
My whole life has been a 20-year struggle between poetry and prose, or if you like, music and the law. Now I am standing at the crossroads and scared about which way to go. My genius points towards art, which is, I'm inclined to think, the right path. But the fact is, and don't be angry with what I'm saying, it always seemed to me as if you were putting obstacles in my way. You have very good reason for doing so, and I understand them all perfectly, and we both agreed to call art an uncertain future and a doubtful way of earning your bread. There can certainly be no greater misery than to look forward to a hopeless, shallow, miserable existence which one has prepared for oneself. I am still at the height of youth and imagination, with plenty of ability to cultivate and ennoble art, and have come to the conclusion that with patience and perseverance and a good teacher, I should in 6 years be as good as any pianist, for piano playing is mere mechanism and execution. Now comes the question, to be or not to be, for you can only do one thing well in this life, and I am always saying to myself, make up your mind to do one thing thoroughly well, and with patience and perseverance, you are bound to achieve something. This battle against myself is now raging more fiercely than ever, my dear mother. Sometimes I am bold and confident in my own strength and power, but at other times I tremble to think of the long way I have come and of the endless road which stretches before me. A beautiful letter, and he finally decides to do it. He begins studying with Wieck and actually lives in the household there, and much to Wieck's consternation, he and Clara fall in love as she becomes a woman. She's actually a remarkable composer as well. I've been playing more and more of her music, most of which she writes when she's 15 or 16 years old, while she's sort of hanging out with Robert. They sort of bounce ideas off each other. When Wieck finds out that they've had their first kiss in the December of 1835, he decides that he's going to take her away on an extended tour. He doesn't want her messing around with Schumann. He thinks Schumann is a decent guy, but probably a little bit of an alcoholic. He's hanging around with prostitutes. He doesn't look like he's going to make money, and he really wants Clara to be a great pianist. I forgot to mention, during this time, Schumann messes up his fingers because he's trying to stretch out, make them independent, and he rips some tendons in his third and fourth fingers, so he can no longer play piano, which was probably good because he was never going to be a great pianist, but it does allow him to compose. Now, the struggle for them to get married is a long one. Over the next 4 years, Schumann is desperate to try to find any way to get together with Clara. At some point, he decides to go right to Wieck and ask him for his daughter's hand. And he says, this is a letter he writes to Clara in 1839. My interview with your father was terrible. He was frigid, hostile, confused, and contradictory all at once. Truly, his method of stabbing is original, for he drives in the hilt as well as the blade. Do all you can to find a way out. I will follow like a child. How my poor head swims. I could laugh from anguish. This cannot continue very much longer. My health won't bear it. God keep me from despair. Ultimately, they actually have to go to court to get married. At the time, if you were underage, which she was, you had to have the father's permission. So they go, and then Wieck actually countersues and slanders Schumann for being a drunk and for lascivious behavior. Ultimately, they actually get married the day before Clara's 21st birthday, so they could have just waited a day, but I think they wanted to put it in Wieck's face. They end up having 8 children. Clara is the main breadwinner as the pianist and a mother. I don't know how she did it, and composing. Schumann is actually not well known as a composer during his lifetime. He's mostly known as a writer about music. He started his own musical journal, writes this very flowery, romantic stuff. He was most likely bipolar. He had long bouts of depression when he could do nothing, and then these manic moments of creative composing. He could write whole quartets and quintets in a day or two, and it would pour out of him, and he didn't know where it came from. But around 1853, he starts to hear a continuous A ringing in his ear, and it sort of drives him crazy. He ultimately, in February of 1854, tries to drown himself in the Rhine River. He is pulled out, but he spends the last 2 years of his life mostly alone, sadly, in an insane asylum. Clara is only able to visit him right as he's dying. A couple quotes that Schumann said. He said, "To send light into the darkness of men's hearts, such is the duty of the artist." And then he said, "To compose is to remember music that has never been written." Beautiful quote. I'm going to play a few of his Kindersehnen. These are children's tunes. He writes these in 1838 during this turmoil while he's trying to be with Clara. And we have a beautiful letter he writes about these pieces. He said, I found out nothing sharpens the imagination as much as expecting and longing for something. And this is how I've been for the last few days. I have been waiting for your letter. And as a result, I have written books full of pieces. Amazing, crazy, sober stuff. You'll stretch your eyes when you open it up. In fact, I sometimes feel as if I'm simply bursting with music. But before I forget, let me tell you what else I've written. Whether it was an echo of something you once said to me, that sometimes I seem to you like a child. At any rate, I suddenly got inspired, and I knocked off about 30 funny little pieces, from which I have chosen 12. He actually ended up choosing 13. They'll amuse you, but of course, you must forget you're a performer. They all explain themselves, and as well as that, they're as easy as you can imagine. So I'm going to do 3 of the Kindersehnen. I'm going to start off with a beautiful piece you'll probably recognize called Of Foreign Lands and People. Again, something that a lot of young kids play when they do a romantic piece. Then a little blind Man's Bluff, a very fast little piece. And then one of Schumann's most famous pieces, Traumerei, also known as Dreaming. These are short little pieces. This was kind of their love song between Robert and Clara. And if you've seen the 1947 Hollywood film, The Song of Love is about the Schumanns and Brahms, who comes in towards the end. This was the theme song. That was with Katharine Hepburn and Paul Henreid. So here are 3 pieces from the Kindersehnen. And let me get out of here. Lovely Traumerei by Schumann, one of my great heroes, wonderful romantic composer. All right, we're going to move to another fantastic romantic composer who also may have tried to kill himself. It's not quite sure. And that is Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer born in 1840, dies in 1893. He came from a family with a long history of military service. His father was a lieutenant colonel in the Department of Mines. He begins piano lessons at the age of 5, but when he's about 11 or 12, his parents sort of send him off to a boarding school, the Imperial School of Jurisprudence. He graduates there in 1859 and is appointed to the Ministry of Justice. And he actually spends 3 years working in the civil service, mostly hating every minute of it, and composing music, taking lessons with some other musicians there in St. Petersburg. And it just so happens that the St. Petersburg Conservatory opens its doors for the first time in 1862. And he decides he's going to be one of the first students to enter this new conservatory that would become one of the great conservatories of all time. He's so good as a student that when he graduates in 1865, he's immediately hired to teach composition at the new Moscow Conservatory that was led by Nicholas Rubinstein. And while he's teaching there, a student falls in love with her. Her name was Antonina Miliakova. And apparently, according to the story, she threatens to kill herself if they do not get married. And so they do get married. And then about 2 months after the wedding, Tchaikovsky tries to kill himself by drowning himself in a river, much like Schumann did. Most scholars now believe he was homosexual and only using the marriage as a cover, and he probably thought he could deal with this and just couldn't do it. And she ends up sort of in an insane asylum later in her life as well, kind of a sad story of Miliakova. But just when that mess is happening, Tchaikovsky gets a letter from a woman he hasn't met named Nadezhda von Meck. She's a very wealthy widow, and she loves Tchaikovsky's music and agrees to pay him a large yearly stipend just to compose music. And Tchaikovsky didn't love teaching, so this was a great opportunity, so he didn't need a steady gig teaching. He could just compose. She had 2 stipulations. The first one was that she said that they could never meet in person, a fascinating stipulation, and as far as we know, they never did. And then he also had to write her letters about the act of composing, in which he did do that, and some of those letters are just beautiful as we get into the mindset of what it is to compose music. He becomes the most celebrated Russian composer and the first to make a lasting impression internationally. And then in 1891, he writes the wonderful Nutcracker Ballet. And he also in that year comes to New York City to conduct for the opening of the new hall in New York, Carnegie Hall. He is the first conductor for that hall. And there's a wonderful quote about his time in America. He writes back to his brother, Modeste. He said, "I was accorded a very warm welcome here, with the local papers all running my portraits and writing stories about me. It looks like I'm even more popular here than I am in Europe. I'm a big shot here. I really am." And then he goes on to say, the Americans are absolutely amazing. Their sincerity, generosity, friendliness, and desire to please are absolutely out of this world. Nowhere but in Russia have I ever seen so much love for foreigners. The American way of life is really good for me. And he actually thought about staying in America. He doesn't, and unfortunately, a couple years after he goes back, he dies of cholera after drinking a glass of unboiled water. But many people think that he knew very well he wasn't supposed to do that and was sort of trying to end things. Von Meck had actually stopped sending money right around this time, and we're not sure why, and that really seemed to depress him. He was a fairly depressed guy. He said, "Truly, there would be reason to go mad were it not for music." And then this great depressing quote, "To regret the past, to hope in the future, and to never be satisfied with the present. That is what I spend my whole life doing." But finally, a quote that I've always loved, he said, "Inspiration is a guest that does not willingly visit the lazy." And so I'm going to play a piece that he writes in about 1868. This is his Romance, Opus 5 in F minor. We think he writes this in Moscow while he was actually having a relationship with another woman, a soprano named Desiree Artaud, who he dedicates this piece to, and some scholars even think they may have briefly been engaged as well. We don't know that for a fact. But here's the lovely Romance. You'll hear this very soft and melancholy beginning and end. In the middle is a more of a kind of Russian march to it that's kind of fun. So the Romance by Tchaikovsky. discussing early Tchaikovsky, written for his girlfriend at the time. All right, we're going to head into the home stretch now, and we're going to move to a composer who I actually wrote my dissertation on, Emmanuel Chabrier. I love this guy. And he actually was a real lawyer for about 20 years. My dissertation was on relationships between musicians and painters in turn-of-the-century Paris. And Chabrier was very good friends with most of the impressionistic painters. In fact, he lived next door to Monet, and supposedly Monet dies in his arms. And he began collecting, was one of the first collectors of impressionistic paintings. His is not a name we know very well in America, but he's beloved by a lot of 20th century French composers. They saw him as kind of the precursor of modern music, because he sort of understood how to write lighter music that was not so Germanic and heavy. His father was a lawyer and determined that his son should follow in his footsteps. He graduates from law school in 1861, joins the French civil service at the Ministry of the Interior, and he works there for 19 years. All the time, he is still composing some music on the side, and ultimately in 1880, he goes to see a production of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, which is very different from the music he would write, but at least he loved it, and he decided at that point he needed to become a full-time composer. And as I mentioned, he was great friends with Monet. He has a wonderful quote. Chabrier said, "My music is the music of today or tomorrow, but certainly not of yesterday. My first concern is to write what pleases me. My second is not to be boring." But he still struggled, and he could not make a great living doing his music. He was just too old to sort of make his way, and he really didn't get discovered until after he died, for the most part. He said, "Never has an artist more loved, more tried to honor music than me. None has suffered more from it, and I will go on suffering from it forever." But this is one of the paintings, the bar at the Folies Bergère, that Chabrier owned. It hung above his piano in his living room. And so he was the first owner of this painting, sort of a gift from Monet to him. And the piece I'm going to play, Idylle, to me is kind of a musical representation of this painting. It's that sort of detached, alienated look of the modern life in Paris, where it seems like everyone's having fun, but there is sort of this objective outsiderness to it that was part of that cafe culture with the absinthe and everything. Now, on the other side, you see a drawing of Chabrier playing the piano by his good friend Edward de Taille. He was known as one of the crazy pianists who ever played, and I have a couple of great descriptions of his playing. Here's one who said, "Chabrier played the piano as no one has ever played it before or ever will. The sight of Chabrier in a drawing room full of elegant women, advancing towards the fragile instrument, and then playing it in a blaze of broken strings, hammers reduced to pulp, and splintered keys, was indescribably droll, and a spectacle of truly epic grandeur." And here's one who wrote, "There was something clown-like and extravagant in his manner and method of playing, which was both exciting and disconcerting. He would pound the piano with his hands, his elbows, his forehead, his stomach, his feet, extract from it the most fantastic sounds, attacking it like a whirlwind, forcing it to give out the most piercing clamor, and only letting it go when the unfortunate instrument had no voice left and was staggering on its feet like a drunken man." And one last description of him comes from the artist Renoir. His wife was actually a very good pianist, a pretty good amateur pianist, and she said the following, "Friends used to compliment me on my piano playing, but one day Chabrier came over, and he played his Espagne for me." That's one of his crazy works. "It sounded as if a hurricane had been let loose in the house. He pounded and pounded the keyboard. It was summertime. The window was open. While he was playing, I happened to look into the street. It was full of people, and they were listening, fascinated. When Chabrier reached the last crashing chords, I swore to myself that I would never touch the piano again. And amateur playing is simply ridiculous. It's like the people who, because they know Renoir, think they can take up painting. Besides, Chabrier had broken several strings and had put the piano out of action." So wonderful stories of Chabrier as a performer. Now the piece I'm going to play is from a set of 10 pieces called the 10 pièces pittoresques, or picturesque pieces. And to me, he was sort of trying to do in music what was going on in the landscape paintings of the Impressionists, these little images, quick blurry images, not meant to be finished works all the time. And this piece that I'm going to do is called Idylle. It's the sixth one of the set. César Franck said after hearing the whole set, "We have just heard something exceptional. This music links our own time to that of Couperin and Rameau." And speaking about this particular piece, Poulenc, who was a great 20th century French composer, said the following after he first heard it as a young boy: "Today I still tremble with emotion thinking of the miracle that happened then. A new harmonic world opened up before me, and my own music has never forgotten that first kiss of love." So you'll hear this sort of very objectified music. It just sort of goes as a beautiful melody on top, but there's a single note that sort of keeps playing all the way through, as if there's commotion around and there's just sort of this hovering alienation above. Here's the Idylle by Chabrier. Oh, let me go back here. That's a little Chabrier, one of my favorite little works there. All right, we're almost done now. We're going to just move over to Finland for a brief look at The composer John Sibelius, 1865 to 1957, Finnish composer and a very good violinist, credited with helping Finland develop its national identity as it struggled for independence from Russia. He starts off studying law at the Imperial Alexander University in 1885, but does not last too long and moves over to the Helsinki Music Institute, where he wants to have a career as a concert violinist, but soon realizes there are too many good violinists around, and he ends up becoming a composer. He writes 7 really wonderful symphonies, but abruptly stops composing in 1926. He was very self-critical and remarked to one friend, "If I cannot write a better symphony than my 7th, then it shall be my last," and apparently burned numerous manuscripts after this, and even some early ones that he wrote. He had a couple of wonderful quotes. He said, "Music begins where the possibilities of language end." And critics were always very hard on him, and he said once, "No statue has ever been erected to a critic." He also was a kind of a wild guy, and he said once, "All the doctors who wanted to forbid me to smoke and drink are now dead." And this beautiful quote, he said, "Music is for me like a beautiful mosaic which God has put together. He takes all the pieces in his hand, throws them into the world, and we have to recreate the picture from the pieces." And I'm going to play a piece that he writes in around the year 1914. It's from Opus 75. There are 5 piano pieces in all. This is the last one. It's a cycle sort of devoted to nature, and this one is called The Spruce. So it's a sort of homage to the trees. Hold on a sec here. Very kind of haunting, waltz-like sound to this piece. Let me find it. Sibelius there, fantastic. All right, we got one more composer to talk about, and this one also means a lot to me because he is also a Harvard Law School dropout. Woohoo! And you know him as Cole Porter, one of our great American songwriters, 1891 to 1964. Born in Peru, Indiana, the grandson of the richest man in Indiana, a coal and timber speculator, James O. Cole. And James Cole had a daughter, Kate, who marries a pharmacist named Samuel Porter. They put their two names together and they got Cole Porter. And he begins playing violin at the age of 6, piano at the age of 8, and writes his first operetta when he's 10 years old. He ends up going to Yale College, where he's an early member of the Whiffenpoofs, the a cappella group there, writes over 300 songs while he's there, including the Yale fight song they still use today called Bulldog, and then enrolls in Harvard Law School in 1913. But in his first year, he decides he can't take it, and he switches over to the music department. He tells his mother, but he makes sure that his grandfather doesn't know, probably because his grandfather's providing all the money, and he would not want him going into the music world. As soon as he graduates, he runs off to Paris, and he serves in the French Foreign Legion, where he had a specially constructed portable piano made so he could entertain the troops while they're in the battlefield. And then it's during the 1920s, he's part of that lost generation in Paris, and he's sort of the main center of it all. His apartment in Les Invalides, lavish parties, people like Hemingway and Stein and Picasso and Fitzgerald, all were hanging out at Cole Porter's place. If you saw the movie Midnight in Paris with Woody Allen, there's a lot with Cole Porter there. Porter was also homosexual like Tchaikovsky and had married a woman named Linda Lee Thomas, who was older than him and a rich Kentucky-born divorcee who provided him with all the money, even though I think he had his own from his inheritance. Unlike Tchaikovsky, their marriage actually goes all the way until she dies in 1954. They were very much devoted to each other in that arrangement. Again, they had this palatial house with platinum wallpaper and chairs upholstered in zebra skin, and apparently he once hired the entire Ballet Russe to come be the entertainment for his guests. He ultimately returns to New York in 1928 with his hit musical Paris, and the song I'm going to do, Let's Do It, is from that musical. He was one of the very few non-Jewish songwriters on Broadway, also one of the few who wrote both the music and the lyrics. There's a fun story about him getting together with Richard Rodgers and saying, what do I need to do? And Rodgers said, maybe try writing a little more Jewish. Maybe that got him going. He had a huge hit in 1934 with Anything Goes, and then Kiss Me Kate in 1948. And unfortunately has a horse riding accident in 1937, has 34 operations, and ultimately has to amputate his leg. So I'm going to play now. I'm actually going to sing. I know it could be horrible, but we're going to try it. This very fun song. This was probably one of the first songs that sort of at least obliquely refers to sex in music. There were 5 total refrains. The first one was all about different ethnic groups, and there were some bad slurs that have been taken out of the music. I think there was one about the Japs and the Chinks or something horrible like that. That was part of that time period, but it's no longer done that way. There was the whole verse on birds, a whole thing on marine life, a whole thing on insects and all mammals who all have to fall in love. So I'm going to sing Let's Do It from the show Paris. Let's see. When the little blue bird who has never said a word starts to sing spring, spring. When the little blue bell in the bottom of the dell starts to ring, ding, ding. When the little blue clerk in the middle of his work starts a tune to the moon up above. It is nature that's all simply telling us to fall in love. And that's why birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it. Oh, let's do it, let's fall in love. In Spain the best upper sets do it, Lithuanian, and let's do it, let's fall in love. The Dutch in old Amsterdam do it, not to mention the Finns. Folks in Siam do it, think a Siamese twin. Some Argentine without means do it. People say in Boston even beans do it. Let's do it, let's fall in love. Romantic sponges, they say, do it. Oysters down in Oyster Bay, do it. Let's do it, let's fall in love. Cold Cape Cod clams against their wish, do it. Even lazy jellyfish, do it. shad, do it. Way to bring me shad row in shallow shoals, English soul.